Claire Bennett stood frozen in the hallway, her phone shaking in her hand, staring at a message that changed everything in a single second. Her husband, Daniel Reeves, was still in the shower, humming a tune like it was any other ordinary evening. But nothing about this evening was ordinary anymore. The name on the screen was not hers. The words were not meant for her eyes. And yet there they were, glowing on the screen, impossible to unsee. 12 years of marriage, 2 children asleep down the hall, a home she had built with her own hands, her own patience, her own quiet sacrifices. All of it now felt like a stage set, something fake dressed up to look real. Claire's fingers tightened around the phone as she read the message again, hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something innocent. They did not. They stayed exactly as painful as before. She thought back to the early years, when Daniel used to call her just to hear her voice, when he used to bring home flowers for no reason at all. She remembered the night he proposed, kneeling on the wet grass outside her parents' house, promising her forever with a shy smile on his face. Forever had felt so certain back then. Now forever felt like a joke someone had played on her without her permission. The bathroom door opened and steam rolled out into the hallway. Daniel walked past her, a towel around his waist, glancing at his phone still in her hand. For a moment, something flickered across his face, but it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by his usual calm, confident expression. He had always been good at hiding things. She realized now that maybe hiding things was the one skill he had truly mastered in their marriage. "You're going to be late for your meeting," Claire said, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She was buying herself time. She needed a moment to think, to breathe, to decide what to do with the fire burning inside her chest. Daniel nodded and disappeared into their bedroom to get dressed, completely unaware, or perhaps completely uncaring, that his world was about to shift. Claire walked slowly into the kitchen, set the phone down on the counter, and stared at her own reflection in the dark window above the sink. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been trying so hard for so long that she had forgotten to ask herself if the effort was even being noticed. Their children, Ellie and Noah, were asleep upstairs, unaware that their parents' marriage was standing on a cliff edge. Claire thought about them first, always them first, the way a mother's mind works even during her own personal storm. What would happen to their small, safe world if the truth came fully into the light? She pushed the thought away for now, telling herself she needed proof, real proof, not just a single message that could still, somehow, have an explanation. But deep down, she already knew. Women always know before they are ready to admit it. Over the following days, Claire began to notice things she had somehow trained herself to ignore. The way Daniel's phone was always face down on tables. The way he stepped outside to take certain calls, even in the cold. The way he came home smelling faintly of a perfume that was not hers, a scent too sweet, too young, too deliberate to be an accident. She noticed the late nights that had slowly become normal, the excuses about work projects that never seemed to end, the way his eyes no longer met hers with the same warmth they once had. She said nothing, not yet. She watched instead, quietly gathering pieces of a puzzle she was terrified to finish assembling. At work, Claire tried to focus on her tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to home. She worked as a school counselor, spending her days helping other people's children manage their fears and worries, while her own fears sat heavy and unspoken inside her. Her colleague and close friend, Grace, noticed the change in her almost immediately. "You've been somewhere else all week," Grace said one afternoon, setting 2 cups of tea on Claire's desk. "Is everything okay at home?" Claire hesitated, the words sitting on the edge of her tongue like a secret too heavy to hold alone. "I don't know," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think something is wrong. I think Daniel is. I think there might be someone else." Grace's face softened with concern, but she did not rush to comfort with empty words. Instead, she simply listened, letting Claire speak for the first time about the small suspicions that had been building for months. It felt strange to say it out loud, to give shape to a fear that had been living silently inside her chest. "Do you have proof?" Grace asked gently. "Not yet," Claire said, "but I think I'm about to." That evening, Claire came home earlier than usual, using a rescheduled meeting as her excuse. The house was quiet when she stepped inside, too quiet for a home that usually had the noise of children's cartoons or Daniel's phone calls filling the air. She found Daniel's laptop open on the kitchen table, left carelessly unlocked, a rare mistake for a man who was usually so careful about hiding his tracks. Claire stood there for a long moment, torn between two versions of herself. One version wanted to close the laptop and walk away, protecting herself from whatever painful truth might be waiting inside. The other version, the one who had spent months swallowing doubt and pretending everything was fine, needed to know. She needed the truth more than she needed comfort. She sat down slowly and began to look. What she found confirmed every fear she had been trying to bury. Messages filled with affection that should have belonged only to her. Photographs that made her stomach turn. A pattern of meetings disguised as work trips, dinners labeled as client meetings, late nights explained away as deadlines that never actually existed. The woman's name appeared again and again. Vanessa Cole, a name Claire had heard mentioned once or twice at office gatherings, always in passing, always dismissed as unimportant. Claire closed the laptop with trembling hands. She did not cry, not yet. The shock was too large for tears in that first moment. She simply sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the life she had built, feeling it crumble silently around her without making a single sound. Upstairs, she could hear Ellie's small feet moving across the floor, probably getting a glass of water before bed. Claire wiped her face, though there were no tears to wipe, and forced herself to stand. Her children needed a mother who could still tuck them in with a steady voice, even if her entire world had just been rearranged in the space of a single evening. She went upstairs, kissed Ellie's forehead, checked on Noah, who was already fast asleep with his stuffed rabbit tucked under his arm, and then returned to her own bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the bed she still shared with a man who had apparently already left her in every way that mattered except physically. When Daniel came home later that night, he found Claire sitting quietly in the dark, the lamp beside the bed still switched off. He assumed she was tired from work, another ordinary evening in their ordinary life. He had no idea that the woman in front of him already knew everything, that she had already seen the truth he had worked so hard to hide. "Long day?" he asked, loosening his tie as he walked into the room. Claire looked at him for a long moment before answering, studying his face as if trying to find the man she had married somewhere underneath the stranger standing in front of her. "Something like that," she said quietly. He didn't notice the way her voice had changed. He didn't notice the distance that had already grown between them, wide and silent, filling the space of their bedroom like a wall neither of them could see, but both would soon have to face. He got ready for bed as if nothing at all was wrong, completely unaware that the woman beside him now carried a truth that would soon break their carefully built world into pieces. Claire lay awake long after his breathing slowed into sleep, staring at the ceiling, replaying every messages, every late night, every small lie disguised as normal life. She thought about confronting him right then, waking him up and demanding answers in the middle of the night. But something told her to wait, to gather her strength first, to decide exactly how she wanted this conversation to happen instead of letting her emotions control the moment. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would speak the truth out loud, and there would be no going back from it. As the night deepened around her, Claire found herself thinking not about anger, but about the years she had given to this marriage, the sacrifices she had made quietly and willingly because she believed in the family they were building together. She thought about the woman she used to be before marriage, before children, before she had folded parts of herself away to make room for a life that was supposed to be shared equally but somehow had not been. She did not know yet what tomorrow would bring, whether Daniel would show remorse or deny everything outright. She did not know that the coming days would test every ounce of strength she possessed, or that the path ahead would eventually lead her somewhere far stronger than the woman lying awake in the darkness tonight. But for now, in the quiet of their bedroom, Claire simply breathed, gathering herself for the storm she knew was coming, unaware that this single sleepless night was only the very beginning of everything that was about to change. Morning arrived with a strange kind of stillness, the kind that settles over a house right before something breaks. Claire moved through her routine with mechanical precision, packing lunches, brushing Ellie's hair, reminding Noah to grab his shoes, all while Daniel sat at the table scrolling through his phone, completely unaware that the woman across from him had spent the night memorizing every piece of evidence against him. She said nothing at breakfast. She said nothing when he kissed her cheek on his way out the door. She said nothing when he told her he might be late again because of a project deadline, the same excuse he had used so many times before that it no longer even sounded convincing. Claire simply nodded, watching him walk to his car with the same confident stride he always had, a man who believed he was getting away with something because no one had told him otherwise yet. But Claire was not the same woman who had gone to bed the night before. Something inside her had hardened, not into anger exactly, but into clarity. She understood now that she had spent months, maybe longer, allowing herself to be quietly deceived while pretending everything was fine for the sake of peace. That peace, she now realized, had never truly been peace at all. It had been silence built on top of a lie. At work, Grace noticed the shift in her friend immediately. Claire looked different, not broken the way Grace had expected, but focused, almost calm in a way that felt unsettling. "You found something," Grace said quietly, closing the office door behind her. "I found everything," Claire replied. She told Grace about the laptop, the messages, the name that kept appearing again and again. Vanessa Cole. Grace's expression darkened as she listened, her hands curling into fists on her lap. "What are you going to do?" Grace asked. "I don't know yet," Claire admitted. "Part of me wants to scream at him the second he walks through the door tonight. Another part of me wants to understand how long this has been going on, how deep it goes, before I decide anything." Grace reached across the desk and took Claire's hand. "Whatever you decide, you don't have to face it alone." Claire appreciated the words, but she also knew that in the end, this was a battle only she could walk through. The betrayal was hers to carry, hers to process, hers to eventually decide what to do with. No amount of support from friends could erase the sharp, personal sting of discovering that the person who had promised to choose her every day had instead been quietly choosing someone else. That afternoon, curiosity pulled Claire toward information she wasn't sure she wanted, but felt she needed. She searched online for Vanessa Cole, and within moments a profile appeared. Younger than Claire by several years, working at the same architecture firm as Daniel, smiling brightly in photographs that seemed carefully curated, vacations, dinners, moments that looked far too polished to be innocent coincidence. Claire studied the photographs longer than she probably should have, searching for something, anything, that might explain why her husband had chosen this woman over the family they had built together. She found nothing that made sense. Vanessa looked ordinary, pleasant even, the kind of woman Claire might have been friendly with under different circumstances. There was no dramatic reason staring back at her from the screen, no obvious explanation. Just a plain, uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people simply choose to betray those who trust them, without needing a justified reason at all. Over the next several days, Claire began quietly preparing herself, not for a screaming confrontation, but for a conversation she intended to control completely. She visited a lawyer during her lunch break, a woman named Sophie Marsh, who specialized in family matters and spoke to Claire with a calm, steady honesty that Claire desperately needed in that moment. "You don't have to decide everything today," Sophie told her. "But it helps to understand your options before emotions take over the conversation at home." Claire listened carefully, taking notes, absorbing information about finances, about the children, about what steps she could take to protect her family regardless of which direction things went. For the first time since discovering the messages, she felt a small sense of control returning to her, a feeling that she was not simply a victim of Daniel's choices, but someone capable of shaping what happened next. Meanwhile, at home, small cracks continued appearing in Daniel's careful performance. He came home one evening with a faint mark of unfamiliar cologne mixed with perfume, a scent Claire immediately recognized from countless late nights she had spent quietly noticing things she once tried to ignore. He mentioned a colleague's name in passing during dinner, Vanessa, before quickly changing the subject, as though realizing his mistake a second too late. Claire watched him carefully during these moments, cataloging every slip, every nervous gesture, every moment his eyes avoided hers just a little too long. She said nothing, waiting patiently, gathering strength rather than evidence now, since the evidence had already been more than enough. One evening, after the children had gone to sleep, Claire found herself sitting across from Daniel in the living room, the television playing quietly in the background, neither of them truly watching it. She studied his face in the dim light, searching for any sign of guilt, any flicker of awareness that his careful double life was about to collapse. "Do you love me?" she asked suddenly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. Daniel looked up, startled by the question. "Of course I do," he said, though something in his tone lacked the conviction it once carried. "Why would you even ask that?" Claire held his gaze, searching for the truth beneath his words. "Just wondering," she said quietly, before standing and walking toward the stairs, leaving him alone with a question he clearly had no honest answer for. That night, lying beside him once again, Claire made a decision. She would not wait indefinitely, allowing him to continue living two separate lives while she quietly suffered in the shadows of his lies. She would choose the moment, the place, the words carefully, but she would not delay much longer. The truth deserved to be spoken aloud, regardless of how painful the aftermath might become. The following weekend, Claire arranged for the children to spend the day with her sister, using the excuse of a family outing to give herself the private space she needed. She spent the morning preparing herself mentally, rehearsing words she hoped she would never actually need to say, yet knowing deep down that today would likely be the day everything finally surfaced. Daniel returned home around noon, his phone buzzing constantly with messages he clearly did not want her to see. Claire watched him from the kitchen doorway, her heart steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "We need to talk," she said simply. Something in her voice must have carried a weight he had never heard before, because for the first time in weeks, Daniel actually looked directly at her, really looked, as though sensing that the ground beneath him was no longer as steady as he had assumed. "About what?" he asked, though his voice already carried a defensive edge, the tone of a man who suspected exactly what was coming but hoped desperately that he was wrong. Claire walked slowly into the living room and sat down, gesturing for him to join her. He hesitated for a moment before following, settling into the chair across from her with visible tension in his shoulders. "I know about Vanessa," Claire said, her voice calm and clear, each word deliberate and controlled despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. The silence that followed felt endless. Daniel's face shifted through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, then something close to panic, before finally settling into a strange, unreadable calm that unsettled Claire more than any reaction she had imagined. "Claire, he started, but the words seemed to fail him, trailing off into nothing. "Don't," Claire said quietly, holding up a hand. "Don't insult me with a lie right now. I've seen the messages, I've seen the photos, I know how long this has been happening. I just want to understand why." Daniel sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, the weight of exposure finally settling over him. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and Claire wondered if this silence was somehow worse than any explanation he could possibly offer. "I never meant for it to happen this way," he finally said, though the words felt hollow, rehearsed almost, like an excuse he had prepared long before this conversation ever occurred. "But it did happen," Claire replied. "For months, apparently, while I was here raising our children, believing in a life you had already stopped believing in yourself." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The silence between them stretched wide and uncomfortable, filled with everything neither of them knew how to say. Claire watched him carefully, searching for remorse, for regret, for any sign that the man she had married still existed somewhere beneath the stranger sitting across from her. What she found instead unsettled her deeply. Rather than shame, something closer to irritation flickered across his face, as though he resented being caught rather than feeling any genuine sorrow for what he had done. It was a small shift, barely noticeable, but Claire caught it clearly, and in that moment she understood something important about the man she had spent 12 years building a life with. This conversation, she realized, was only the beginning. Whatever came next would reveal exactly who Daniel truly was, not the version she had imagined for over a decade, but the real man hiding underneath, and Claire was no longer sure she wanted to know him at all. The silence in the living room stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until Daniel finally spoke again, his voice carrying none of the softness Claire had expected, none of the guilt she had hoped might soften this unbearable moment. "You went through my laptop," he said, his tone shifting from shock into something closer to accusation, as if her discovery of the truth was somehow a greater offense than the truth itself. Claire stared at him, genuinely stunned by the direction his words had taken. "That's what you're focused on right now, not the fact that you've been lying to me for months, but the fact that I found out." Daniel stood up abruptly, pacing across the living room floor, his movements agitated, defensive. "You don't understand what it's been like," he said. "You've been so wrapped up in the kids, in the house, in everything except us. I felt invisible in my own marriage." Claire felt something cold settle in her chest, replacing the earlier ache with a sharper, more focused anger. "So your solution to feeling invisible was to find someone else to make you feel seen, instead of talking to me, instead of telling me you were struggling." "It's not that simple," Daniel snapped, his voice rising slightly. "It is that simple," Claire replied, her own voice steady despite the storm building inside her. "You made a choice. Every single time you lied about where you were, every time you disappeared into another room to answer her messages, every time you looked me in the eyes and pretended everything was fine, you made a choice. And you kept making that same choice, over and over again, for months." Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression hardening into something Claire barely recognized. Gone was the man who used to bring her coffee in bed on lazy Sunday mornings. In his place stood someone colder, someone who seemed almost relieved that the truth was finally out in the open, freeing him from the exhausting effort of hiding it any longer. "Maybe I did make a choice," he said, his voice carrying an edge of defiance now. "Maybe being with Vanessa reminded me what it feels like to actually be happy, instead of just going through the motions with someone who stopped trying a long time ago." The words landed like a blow, sharp and deliberate, designed to wound rather than explain. Claire felt tears rising, hot and unwelcome, blurring her vision as the weight of his cruelty settled fully upon her. She had expected guilt. She had expected excuses, even denial. She had not expected him to turn the blame so completely onto her, twisting 12 years of shared sacrifice into a story where she alone had failed. "You're blaming me," she said quietly, her voice trembling now despite her earlier resolve to remain calm. "After everything, you're actually sitting here blaming me for your affair." Daniel shrugged, an infuriatingly casual gesture that made Claire's chest tighten painfully. "I'm just being honest for once," he said. "Isn't that what you wanted?" "The truth." Claire wiped at her eyes, furious with herself for allowing the tears to fall in front of him, furious that even now, in the middle of her own righteous anger, some small wounded part of her still hoped he might say something to make this all make sense in a way that didn't destroy everything she believed about their life together. But instead of softening, Daniel's expression only grew more distant, more detached, as though watching her cry confirmed something he had already decided about their marriage long before this conversation ever began. "This is exactly why I stopped talking to you about how I felt," he said. "Because this is what happens, tears, guilt trips. You make everything so heavy, Claire. Vanessa doesn't do that. Being around her is easy." Claire let out a bitter, disbelieving laugh, though there was no humor in it at all. "Easy," she repeated. "You want easy. Marriage isn't supposed to be easy every single day, Daniel. It's supposed to be worth it. There's a difference." He said nothing, his silence somehow louder than any argument could have been. Claire watched him standing there, arms crossed, expression unreadable, and felt something inside her finally, completely break, not into pieces of despair, but into a strange, clarifying resolve. "Get out," she said quietly. Daniel blinked, clearly not expecting those particular words. "What?" "You heard me," Claire said, standing now, her voice steadier than she felt. "If being with her is so easy, if I'm the reason you had to lie and sneak around for months, then go. Go be with her. Stop pretending you want to be here." For a moment, something flickered across Daniel's face, hesitation perhaps, or the faintest trace of doubt. But it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, replaced once again by that same infuriating calm. "Fine," he said. "Maybe that's exactly what I'll do." He turned and walked upstairs without another word, leaving Claire standing alone in the living room, her tears finally falling freely now that he was no longer there to witness them, no longer there to twist her pain into something she should apologize for. She listened to the sounds coming from their bedroom above, drawers opening and closing, hangers sliding across the closet rod, the unmistakable sound of a man packing a bag with quick, deliberate movements. Every sound felt like a small, separate wound, confirmation that the man she had loved for over a decade was truly choosing to walk away rather than fight for what they had built together. When Daniel came back downstairs, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, Claire remained standing in the same spot, arms wrapped around herself as though physically holding herself together. He paused near the front door, glancing at her one final time. "You'll see," he said. "This is better for both of us." Claire said nothing, watching him through blurred, tear-filled eyes as he opened the door and stepped outside into the fading evening light. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the house louder than she thought possible, a final, definitive punctuation mark on 12 years of shared life. She heard his car start in the driveway, the engine revving slightly before pulling away, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it disappeared completely, leaving only silence behind. Claire sank onto the couch, finally allowing herself to fully collapse into the grief she had been holding back for days, sobbing quietly into her hands in the empty living room where their family photographs still hung on the walls, smiling faces frozen in a happiness that now felt like a cruel joke. She did not know how long she sat there, crying until her body simply had nothing left to give. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and she found herself staring blankly at the darkened television screen, her reflection faint and hollow-eyed staring back at her. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, a message from Grace, checking in as she often did. Claire stared at the screen for a long moment before finally responding with shaking fingers. "He left, he's gone," to her. The reply came almost instantly. "I'm coming over right now, don't argue with me." Claire didn't have the strength to argue anyway. Within 20 minutes, Grace arrived at the door, pulling Claire into a tight embrace the moment she stepped inside. No words were needed in that first embrace, just the simple comfort of not being completely alone in the wreckage of the evening. They sat together on the couch as Claire recounted everything that had happened, every cruel word Daniel had spoken, every moment he had turned her pain into something to be dismissed rather than acknowledged. Grace listened quietly, her expression darkening with each detail, her hand never leaving Claire's throughout the entire retelling. "He actually blamed you," Grace said finally, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "After everything, he had the audacity to make this your fault." "He said being with her is easy," Claire said, her voice hollow. "Like our marriage, our family, everything we built together was some kind of burden he was finally free from." Grace shook her head slowly. "That's not love, Claire. That's not even close to love. That's someone looking for an excuse to justify choices he had already made long before tonight." Claire nodded, though the understanding did little to ease the raw ache still burning in her chest. Somewhere across town, Daniel was likely arriving at Vanessa's apartment right now, probably expecting comfort, probably expecting the warm welcome he felt entitled to after finally choosing the easier path. Claire wondered briefly, bitterly, what kind of welcome truly awaited him there. Whether Vanessa would greet him with open arms, celebrating the fact that he had finally left his family behind for her. or whether reality might prove far more complicated than either of them had prepared for. But that thought, for now, felt distant and unimportant compared to the immediate task in front of her. Figuring out how to explain to Ellie and Noah, in the morning, why their father would not be coming home. Grace stayed late into the night, helping Claire think through the practical matters that suddenly demanded attention, contacting the lawyer she had already met with, deciding what to tell the children, arranging her schedule for the difficult days ahead. Through it all, Claire felt a strange combination of devastation and clarity, as though losing the illusion of her marriage had somehow, painfully, opened her eyes to a truth she desperately needed to see. Before Grace finally left, close to midnight, she took Claire's hands firmly in her own. "You did nothing wrong," she said. "Not tonight, not for the past 12 years. Whatever happens next, remember that." Claire nodded, though the words would take much longer to truly sink in and settle into belief, rather than simple comfort. After Grace left, Claire climbed the stairs slowly, pausing outside her children's bedrooms, listening to their soft, peaceful breathing, grateful that sleep had spared them from witnessing the storm that had torn through their home earlier that evening. She entered her own bedroom, now feeling strangely large and empty without Daniel's presence, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before finally lying down. Sleep did not come easily, her mind replaying the conversation over and over, searching for moments where she might have said something differently, though deep down she knew nothing she could have said would have changed his decision. Somewhere in that quiet house, surrounded by the wreckage of her old life, Claire made a silent promise to herself. She would grieve, she would cry, she would allow herself the space to fully feel the pain of this betrayal. But she would not stay broken forever. Tomorrow, she would wake up and begin, slowly, the difficult work of rebuilding, not just for her children, but for herself as well. Across town, unaware of the quiet strength forming inside the woman he had left behind, Daniel pulled into Vanessa's apartment complex, his duffel bag on the passenger seat, his heart pounding with something between relief and nervous anticipation. He imagined the welcome waiting for him, imagined Vanessa's arms wrapping around him, telling him he had made the right decision, that everything from this point forward would finally be easy, exactly as he had promised himself it would be. He had no idea, as he climbed the stairs to her door, that the welcome he expected was about to become the very last thing he received. Daniel stood outside Vanessa's apartment door, his duffel bag heavy on his shoulder, his knuckles raised to knock, but hesitating for just a moment as a strange nervousness settled over him. He had imagined this exact scene countless times over the past several months, whispered promises exchanged during stolen moments, the idea that leaving his old life behind would finally lead him toward something better, something easier, something he deserved. He knocked twice, straightening his jacket, rehearsing the confident smile he planned to offer the moment the door opened. Several long seconds passed before he heard footsteps approaching from inside, slower and more hesitant than he expected. When the door finally opened, Vanessa stood there in casual clothes, her hair pulled back messily, her expression far from the warm welcome he had anticipated. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying a strange flatness that immediately unsettled him. "What are you doing here?" The question caught him completely off guard. He had expected excitement, relief, perhaps even tears of joy at the news that he had finally chosen her, finally walked away from his marriage the way she had encouraged him to do so many times during their late-night conversations. "I left," he said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice despite the growing unease in his chest. "I told Claire everything. I'm here now. We can finally be together properly without hiding anymore." Vanessa's expression did not shift into the joy he expected. Instead, something closer to panic flickered across her face, quickly replaced by a careful, guarded blankness that Daniel found deeply unfamiliar. This was not the woman who had laughed easily during their dinners together, who had whispered promises about a future filled with possibility. "You can't stay here," she said abruptly, glancing nervously over her shoulder into the apartment behind her. Daniel blinked, confusion settling heavily over him. "What do you mean I can't stay here? Vanessa, I just left my entire family for you." I gave up everything. I never asked you to do that, Vanessa said quickly, her voice sharper now, defensive in a way that made Daniel's confidence begin to crumble. I told you things were complicated. I never told you to leave your wife. The words hit him like a physical blow, each one chipping away at the certainty he had carried with him during the drive over. You said you loved me, he said, his voice rising slightly. You said we could have a future together, that all we needed was time. Vanessa glanced nervously behind her once more before stepping outside into the hallway, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. As though hiding something inside the apartment she desperately did not want him to see or hear. Daniel, things are complicated right now, she said, lowering her voice. This isn't a good time, you need to go somewhere else tonight. Somewhere else, Daniel repeated, disbelief coloring his tone. I don't have anywhere else to go, I left my house, I left my family. Where exactly do you expect me to go? Before Vanessa could answer, a sound came from inside the apartment, footsteps moving across the floor, followed by a male voice calling out her name. Daniel's stomach dropped as understanding began to dawn slowly, painfully, across his face. Who's that? He demanded, his voice tight. Vanessa's expression shifted into something close to panic. It's nobody, she said quickly. Just a friend. But the apartment door opened further behind her, revealing a man Daniel had never seen before, tall and confident, wearing only a casual t-shirt and sweatpants, clearly comfortable in a space that Daniel had believed belonged only to him and Vanessa. The man's eyes flicked between Daniel and Vanessa with obvious confusion, though not the surprised confusion of someone discovering something unexpected. Everything okay out here? The man asked, his tone casual, familiar, the tone of someone who had clearly spent considerable time in this apartment before tonight. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, understanding crashing over him in waves he could not stop or slow down. Who is this? He asked again, his voice quieter now, though the tremor beneath it was impossible to hide. Vanessa sighed, the careful mask she had been wearing finally slipping away entirely, revealing something colder underneath, something almost bored. This is Nathan, she said simply. We've been seeing each other for a while now. The words landed with devastating clarity. Daniel stood frozen in the hallway, his duffel bag still heavy on his shoulder, the family he had abandoned only hours earlier suddenly feeling impossibly, painfully distant. He had given up everything, his home, his children, his marriage, for a woman who apparently had never truly been his to begin with. You told me you loved me, he said again, his voice barely above a whisper now, all his earlier confidence completely drained away. Vanessa's expression softened only slightly, though not with the guilt Daniel desperately needed to see. I did love spending time with you, she said carefully. But Daniel, we worked together, we had fun. I never once told you to blow up your entire life over this. That was your decision, not mine. You knew I was married, Daniel said, anger beginning to mix with his shock now. You knew I had children, you still let this happen. And you're the one who chose to lie to your wife for months, Vanessa shot back, her patience clearly wearing thin. Don't stand here acting like I forced you into anything. You wanted this just as much as I did, until apparently you decided to take it more seriously than I ever intended. Nathan shifted uncomfortably behind her, clearly unsure whether to stay or retreat back inside the apartment. Vanessa, maybe I should go, he offered quietly. No, Vanessa said firmly, not looking away from Daniel. You stay right there, Daniel was just leaving. The finality in her voice left no room for argument, no space for the desperate explanations Daniel felt building inside his chest. He looked between Vanessa and Nathan, understanding fully now that the fantasy he had constructed in his mind over the past several months had never matched the reality standing in front of him. I gave up everything for you, he said one final time, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of the realization settling fully over him now. Vanessa's expression remained unmoved, almost cold in its detachment. I never asked you to, she repeated. That's not on me, Daniel, that's entirely on you. She stepped back into the apartment, Nathan following closely behind her, and closed the door quietly but firmly, the sound echoing through the empty hallway like a final verdict on everything Daniel had believed to be true about the past several months of his life. Daniel stood alone outside the closed door for several long minutes, his duffel bag still slung over his shoulder, his mind struggling to process the sudden, devastating collapse of the future he had convinced himself was waiting for him here. The confident swagger he had carried into this building had completely evaporated, replaced by a hollow, disorienting numbness that made his legs feel unsteady beneath him. He finally turned and walked slowly back down the hallway, descending the stairs toward the parking lot where his car sat waiting, silent and empty, exactly as empty as the future he now faced. He climbed inside, gripping the steering wheel tightly, staring blankly through the windshield at nothing in particular. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message, though not the one he had hoped to receive tonight. It was from a colleague, casual and unrelated to the chaos currently consuming his personal life. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down on the passenger seat, next to the duffel bag that now felt heavier than it had any physical right to be. Where was he supposed to go now? He could not return home, not after the words he had spoken to Claire, not after walking out the door with such careless confidence, so certain he was moving toward something better. He thought briefly about calling a friend, but quickly realized how few genuine friendships he had actually maintained over the past several months, too consumed by his secret relationship to invest properly in anyone else. He drove aimlessly for nearly an hour before finally checking into a small hotel on the edge of town, the kind of place with dim lighting and thin walls, the kind of place that felt appropriately hollow for the state of his current life. He sat on the edge of the stiff hotel bed, staring at his own reflection in the mirror across the room, hardly recognizing the exhausted, defeated man staring back at him. For the first time in months, doubt crept fully into his mind, doubt about every decision he had made, every lie he had told, every moment he had chosen convenience and excitement over the steady, dependable love waiting for him at home. He thought about Claire's face during their final conversation, the tears she had tried so hard to hide, the way he had dismissed her pain so callously in favor of a fantasy that had ultimately proven completely worthless. He thought about Ellie and Noah, probably confused tomorrow morning when they realized their father was not coming home for breakfast. Guilt began pressing heavily against his chest, though it arrived far too late to change anything that had already happened. Daniel lay back against the hotel pillows, staring blankly at the ceiling, the silence of the unfamiliar room pressing in around him like a physical weight. Somewhere across the city, Claire was likely asleep, perhaps finally finding a small measure of peace despite everything he had put her through. And here he sat, completely alone, having sacrificed everything for a woman who had never truly wanted him the way he had convinced himself she did. The welcome he had expected, the warm arms and celebratory relief he had imagined during the entire drive over, had never materialized. Instead, he had found rejection, humiliation, and the devastating realization that the family he had so carelessly discarded might have been the only genuine, steady love he had ever truly possessed. As exhaustion finally began pulling him toward an uneasy sleep, Daniel could not shake the feeling that tonight was only the beginning of consequences he had never properly anticipated. Consequences that would follow him far beyond this single humiliating evening, reshaping every part of the life he had once taken so carelessly for granted. Morning light filtered weakly through the thin curtains of the hotel room, pulling Daniel from a shallow, restless sleep that had done nothing to ease the exhaustion weighing on him. For a brief, disoriented moment, he forgot where he was, reaching instinctively for a phone alarm that wasn't sounding, expecting the familiar comfort of his own bedroom before the memories of the previous night crashed back over him all at once. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face with both hands, the humiliation of the night before settling into his chest like a stone that refused to move. Vanessa's cold dismissal replayed in his mind, along with Nathan's casual, unbothered presence inside an apartment Daniel had once believed belonged only to the two of them. He had built an entire fantasy around a relationship that had apparently meant something completely different to Vanessa than it had meant to him. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. For a foolish moment, hope flickered inside him, wondering if perhaps Claire had reached out, if perhaps there was still some path back toward the life he had so carelessly abandoned. But the message was from his firm's office manager, a routine reminder about an upcoming client presentation, completely unaware of the personal chaos currently unfolding in his life. Daniel dragged himself out of bed and into the small hotel bathroom, splashing cold water on his face, staring at his own reflection for a long, uncomfortable moment. The man looking back at him seemed unfamiliar, tired eyes, unshaven jaw, none of the confident swagger he had carried with him into Vanessa's apartment building just hours earlier. He needed to go to work. Life, apparently, did not pause simply because his personal world had collapsed overnight. He dressed slowly, pulling a wrinkled shirt from his duffel bag, the same bag he had packed so hastily and confidently the previous evening, believing it would carry him toward a new beginning rather than toward this humiliating, hollow morning. The drive to the office felt longer than usual, his mind replaying every detail of the previous night on a painful, unwanted loop. He arrived at the firm later than he intended, slipping quietly through the front doors, hoping to avoid conversation with anyone until he had time to properly compose himself. That hope did not last long. As he walked toward his office, he passed Vanessa's desk, and for a brief, awkward moment, their eyes met across the open floor plan. Her expression carried none of the warmth from their earlier months together, only a careful, professional distance, as though the entire relationship between them had simply never happened at all. Daniel quickly looked away, continuing toward his office, his face burning with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Around him, the normal rhythm of office life continued uninterrupted, phones ringing, conversations murmuring, printers humming in the background, completely indifferent to the personal devastation he was quietly carrying with him through the hallways. He closed his office door behind him and sat heavily in his chair, staring blankly at his computer screen without truly seeing anything displayed there. A knock interrupted his thoughts moments later. Nathan, the man from Vanessa's apartment, stood in the doorway, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Do you have a minute?" Nathan asked, stepping inside without waiting for an actual answer. Daniel's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" Nathan closed the door behind him, glancing around the office briefly before speaking. "Look, I didn't know about your situation with Vanessa, not the full extent of it anyway. She told me you two were just work friends, nothing serious." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "That's convenient." "I'm serious," Nathan continued. "We've been together for almost a year now. I had no idea she was seeing someone else on the side, especially not someone married with kids." The words landed with an entirely new weight, confirming something Daniel hadn't fully allowed himself to consider the night before. Vanessa hadn't simply been confused about her feelings or caught between two options. She had been maintaining an entire separate relationship, an entire separate life, running parallel to the fantasy she had carefully constructed for Daniel over the past several months. "Almost a year," Daniel repeated numbly. Nathan nodded, clearly uncomfortable delivering this particular piece of information. "I actually thought we might be getting engaged soon. That's part of why last night was such a shock for me too." Daniel sat back in his chair, processing this new layer of betrayal atop the devastation he had already been carrying. He had convinced himself that Vanessa's feelings for him, however complicated, had at least been genuine. Discovering that he had merely been one part of an elaborate deception, she was running on multiple fronts, simultaneously stripped away even that small, fragile comfort. "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked finally. Nathan shrugged, though his expression remained serious. "Because I think we both deserve better than being lied to. I don't know what you're going to do about it, but I plan on having a very different conversation with Vanessa when I see her next." After Nathan left, Daniel sat alone in his office for a long time, the silence pressing in around him uncomfortably. Word of the previous night's confrontation had apparently already begun spreading quietly through the office. Judging by the occasional curious glance directed his way throughout the morning, colleagues who normally greeted him warmly now offering only brief, awkward nods before hurrying past. By midday, Daniel's manager called him into a private meeting, his tone carefully professional but noticeably tense. There have been some concerns raised about workplace conduct, his manager explained carefully, avoiding direct mention of Vanessa's name, though the implication remained unmistakable. We need to discuss how you plan to handle your professional responsibilities moving forward, separate from your personal situation. Daniel nodded stiffly, humiliation burning through him as he realized the private disaster of his personal life had now begun bleeding visibly into his professional reputation as well. He left the meeting feeling smaller than he had in years. The confident architect who once walked these halls with easy authority, now reduced to careful, apologetic explanations about his own poor judgment. He returned to his office and closed the door, finally allowing himself a moment of genuine, unguarded despair. He thought about calling Claire, desperate suddenly for the comfort of a familiar voice, someone who had known him for over a decade, rather than the fleeting months of a relationship that had apparently meant nothing at all to the person on the other side of it. He picked up his phone and stared at Claire's contact information for a long moment before finally setting the phone back down, unable to summon the courage to actually make the call. What would he even say? Sorry seemed impossibly small compared to the damage he had caused. And some small, honest part of him recognized that any apology offered right now would sound less like genuine remorse and more like desperation born from rejection elsewhere. Instead, he called his brother, Oliver, someone he hadn't spoken to properly in months, too consumed by his secret relationship to maintain the relationships that had once been steady fixtures in his life. Daniel, Oliver answered, surprise evident in his voice. It's been a while. I need somewhere to stay, Daniel admitted, the words feeling heavy and humiliating as he spoke them aloud. Just for a few days until I figure things out. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What happened? Oliver asked carefully. Daniel hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, though he suspected Oliver would find out eventually regardless of what he chose to share now. I made some mistakes, he said finally. Big ones. Claire and I are. Things are complicated right now. Oliver sighed audibly through the phone. You can stay here, he said. But Daniel, I'm not going to pretend I'm not disappointed. Claire's a good woman. Whatever you did, I hope you're prepared to actually face it, not just hide from it. The words stung, though Daniel knew he had no right to feel offended by them. He thanked Oliver quietly and ended the call, gathering his things to leave the office early, unable to concentrate on work with everything else weighing so heavily on his mind. As he walked through the parking lot toward his car, his phone buzzed once more. This time, it was a message from Vanessa, the first communication from her since their confrontation outside her apartment door the previous night. We should keep things professional at work from now on. What happened outside my apartment doesn't need to affect anything here. Daniel stared at the message for a long moment, disbelief washing over him at the casual, dismissive tone, as though the emotional devastation of the past 24 hours amounted to nothing more than an inconvenient scheduling conflict. He typed several responses, deleting each one before finally settling on a simple reply. Understood. There was nothing else left to say. Whatever fantasy he had constructed around their relationship had been thoroughly, completely dismantled, leaving behind only professional awkwardness and the painful reality of everything he had sacrificed for something that had ultimately proven worthless. He drove to Oliver's apartment that evening, carrying his duffel bag up the stairs like a man carrying the weight of every poor decision he had made over the past several months. Oliver greeted him at the door with a brief, tense hug, gesturing him inside without unnecessary conversation. You look terrible, Oliver said bluntly, settling onto the couch across from where Daniel sat. I feel terrible, Daniel admitted. Over the following hour, Daniel found himself explaining everything, The affair, the confrontation with Claire, the humiliating discovery at Vanessa's apartment, the professional consequences already beginning to unfold at work. Oliver listened quietly, his expression shifting between disappointment and genuine concern throughout the entire retelling. "You threw away your family for someone who was seeing another man the entire time," Oliver said finally, shaking his head slowly. "Daniel, I don't even know what to say to that." "Neither do I," Daniel admitted quietly. That night, lying on Oliver's spare couch, staring up at an unfamiliar ceiling in an unfamiliar apartment, Daniel found himself confronting the full weight of his choices for the first time without the comfortable fantasy of Vanessa's affection to soften the blow. He thought about Claire, about the children, about the home he had walked away from so carelessly, convinced he was moving toward something better. He had gained nothing from his decision except isolation, professional embarrassment, and the devastating realization that the woman he had sacrificed everything for had never truly valued him the way he desperately wanted to believe. Sleep, when it finally came, offered little comfort, filled instead with fragmented images of Claire's tearful face, and the cold, dismissive expression Vanessa had worn while closing the door on him the previous night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, conversations with his children that he dreaded, decisions about his marriage that felt impossibly complicated, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life from the wreckage of choices he could never take back. For the first time since this entire situation began, Daniel understood, fully and completely, the true cost of what he had done, though understanding it now did absolutely nothing to undo the damage already spreading through every corner of his life. 3 days passed before Daniel worked up the courage to call Claire, each day heavier than the last, filled with the strange, hollow rhythm of a life he no longer recognized as his own. He spent his mornings at work, avoiding Vanessa's side of the office entirely, and his evenings at Oliver's apartment, staring at his phone, composing messages he never actually sent. When he finally called, Claire answered on the third ring, her voice guarded and tired. "Daniel," she said, neither warm nor cold, simply neutral in a way that felt somehow more painful than outright anger would have been. "I want to see the kids," Daniel said, his voice unsteady despite his attempt to sound composed. "I want to explain things to them." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "They're confused enough already," Claire said finally. "Noah keeps asking when you're coming home. Ellie stopped asking after the second day, which honestly worries me more." Daniel closed his eyes, guilt pressing heavily against his chest. "I know I don't deserve to ask you for anything right now," he said. "But please let me see them. I'll do whatever you think is best. Just tell me when and where." Claire agreed, reluctantly, to arrange a visit that weekend at a neutral location, a small park near their neighborhood where the children often played. She made it clear, in a tone that left no room for argument, that this visit would be about the children and nothing else. The weekend arrived slowly, each day dragging by with unbearable weight. When Daniel finally arrived at the park, he spotted Claire sitting on a bench near the playground, Ellie and Noah playing nearby, their laughter carrying faintly across the open space. For a moment, watching them from a distance, Daniel felt the full, crushing weight of everything he had thrown away. Noah spotted him first, running across the grass with the pure, uncomplicated joy only a child could offer in a situation this painful. "Daddy!" he shouted, wrapping his small arms around Daniel's legs. Daniel knelt down, hugging his son tightly, fighting back tears that threatened to overwhelm him completely. Ellie approached more slowly, her expression far more guarded than her brother's, clearly old enough to sense that something significant had shifted within their family, even if she didn't fully understand the details. "Hi, sweetheart," Daniel said softly, opening his arms for her. Ellie hesitated for a moment before finally allowing a brief, stiff hug, pulling away quickly afterward, her eyes searching his face for answers he wasn't entirely sure how to provide. Claire watched from the bench, her expression carefully neutral, though Daniel could see the tension held tightly in her shoulders. They spent the next hour at the playground, Daniel pushing Noah on the swings, watching Ellie climb carefully across the monkey bars, trying desperately to create some semblance of normalcy despite the obvious fractures beneath the surface. Claire remained mostly quiet throughout the visit, speaking only when necessary, her interactions with Daniel polite but distant. When it came time to leave, Ellie finally spoke the question Daniel had been dreading since the moment he arrived. "Are you coming home with us?" she asked quietly, her small voice carrying far more weight than her simple words suggested. Daniel knelt down to her level, searching for words that could possibly soften an answer that would only cause further pain regardless of how carefully he phrased it. "Not right now, sweetheart," he said gently. "But that doesn't mean I love you any less. I'll see you again very soon, I promise." Ellie nodded, though her expression remained guarded, clearly unconvinced by promises that had already proven unreliable once before. Claire gathered the children's things quietly, preparing to leave, and Daniel found himself standing awkwardly nearby, uncertain how to bridge the enormous distance that now existed between them. "Claire," he said as she began walking toward the car with the children, "can we talk, just for a minute?" Claire paused, turning back toward him with an expression that carried exhaustion rather than anger now. "What is there left to say, Daniel?" "I made a terrible mistake," he said, the words tumbling out faster than he intended. "I understand that now. I understand what I threw away. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now, but I am asking if there's any possibility someday that we could work through this." Claire studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Do you know what hurt the most?" she asked finally. "It wasn't even the affair itself, though that was devastating enough on its own. It was the way you looked at me when I confronted you. The way you blamed me instead of taking responsibility. The way you walked out that door so easily, without a single moment of hesitation, like 12 years together meant nothing at all." Daniel had no response that felt adequate against the weight of her words. "I was wrong," he said simply, "about all of it." "Maybe you were," Claire said. "But being wrong now doesn't erase what you did then. Trust isn't something you can just rebuild because things didn't work out the way you wanted them to elsewhere." The words stung sharply, though Daniel recognized the painful truth within them. He had not returned to Claire out of genuine reflection or remorse initially, but rather because his alternative option had collapsed entirely beneath him. Claire, perceptive as always, had seen through that reality immediately, understanding exactly what motivated his current desperation for reconciliation. "I know I hurt you," Daniel said quietly. "I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm asking anyway because I finally understand what I actually lost." Claire's expression softened only slightly, though her resolve remained firm. "I need time, Daniel. Time to figure out who I am outside of this marriage, time to heal, time to decide what's actually best for our children moving forward. I can't make any promises about us right now, and honestly, I don't think you should expect me to." She turned and walked toward the car, buckling the children into their seats with practiced efficiency, leaving Daniel standing alone in the park, watching the family he had once taken for granted drive away without him once again. Over the following weeks, Daniel settled into an uneasy routine at Oliver's apartment, attending scheduled visits with his children whenever Claire allowed them, working through increasingly awkward days at the office where Vanessa continued treating their entire history together as though it had barely happened at all. He began seeing a therapist, at Oliver's insistence, someone who helped him slowly unpack the selfish patterns that had led him toward such devastating choices in the first place. During one particularly difficult session, his therapist, a calm, thoughtful woman named Grace Whitmore, asked him a question that lingered with him long after the appointment ended. "What do you think you were actually searching for with Vanessa?" she asked. "Because from what you've described, it doesn't sound like it was really about her at all." Daniel sat with the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "I think I was searching for a version of myself that felt exciting again," he admitted. "Someone who felt important, desired instead of just ordinary. Married life started feeling routine, and I mistook that routine for something being wrong, rather than understanding it as simply part of building a life with someone long-term." "And now," Grace Whitmore asked gently, Now I understand that what I actually had with Claire was never boring, Daniel said, his voice thick with regret. It was steady. It was real. I just wasn't mature enough to appreciate the difference between excitement and genuine love, until I had already destroyed the second one chasing the first. These sessions became a slow, difficult process of rebuilding his own understanding of himself, separate entirely from whether or not Claire ever chose to forgive him. He began writing letters to his children, letters he didn't send but kept privately, working through his own guilt and hoping that someday, when they were older, he might share these honest reflections with them directly. Meanwhile, at the office, tensions surrounding his personal situation continued affecting his professional standing. Colleagues who once respected him now regarded him with quiet, unspoken judgment, and his relationship with Vanessa, though officially ended, cast a long shadow over his daily interactions within the firm. Eventually, feeling the mounting pressure from all directions, Daniel made the difficult decision to transfer to a different branch of the company entirely, hoping distance might offer some small measure of the fresh start he desperately needed. Through it all, one truth became increasingly clear to him. Rebuilding trust, rebuilding respect, rebuilding any possibility of reconciliation with Claire would require far more than apologies and good intentions. It would require sustained, consistent proof of genuine change, patience without any guarantee of the outcome he hoped for, and complete acceptance that Claire owed him absolutely nothing in return for his newfound understanding. As autumn settled over the city, bringing cooler days and shorter afternoons, Daniel found himself slowly adjusting to a life fundamentally different from the one he had carelessly walked away from months earlier. He no longer expected quick forgiveness or easy resolution. Instead, he focused on the difficult, unglamorous work of becoming someone worthy of his children's respect, regardless of whether that work ever led him back into the family he had once taken so completely for granted. Claire stood in the kitchen on a quiet Saturday morning, sunlight streaming through the window above the sink, watching Ellie and Noah build an elaborate tower out of building blocks on the living room floor. The house felt different now, months after Daniel's departure, not empty exactly, but reshaped into something entirely her own, filled with a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed until circumstances forced her to find it. The early weeks after Daniel left had been the hardest of her life, harder even than the confrontation itself. She had spent countless nights lying awake, wondering if she had made the right decision, wondering if she should have fought harder to save something that had once felt so permanent. But slowly, gradually, those doubts had begun transforming into something steadier, a growing understanding that walking away from betrayal wasn't weakness, but rather the clearest form of self-respect available to her. She had returned to work full-time almost immediately, finding unexpected comfort in the familiar routine of helping students navigate their own struggles, a welcome distraction from the chaos unfolding in her personal life. Grace remained a constant source of support throughout those difficult early months, checking in regularly, sitting with Claire through countless evenings when the silence of the house felt unbearably heavy. "You're doing better than you think you are," Grace told her one afternoon, as they sat together in Claire's kitchen, sharing coffee while the children napped upstairs. Claire smiled faintly, stirring her coffee slowly. "Some days I believe that," she admitted. "Other days I still feel like I'm just barely holding everything together." "That's normal," Grace said gently. "You don't have to feel completely healed to be doing well. You're showing up every single day for your kids, for yourself. That counts for so much more than you realize." Over the following months, Claire began rediscovering parts of herself that had quietly faded into the background during her marriage. She enrolled in a pottery class on Wednesday evenings, something she had wanted to try years earlier, but had never made time for amid the demands of family life. She reconnected with old friends she had drifted away from, rebuilding a social circle that felt genuinely her own rather than shaped around Daniel's preferences and schedule. Financially, the transition proved challenging at first. Claire worked closely with her lawyer, Sophie Marsh, navigating the complicated process of separating shared finances, negotiating custody arrangements, and ensuring stability for her children throughout the difficult transition. Sophie proved to be more than just a legal advisor during this period, offering steady encouragement whenever Claire's confidence wavered. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," Sophie told her during one particularly difficult meeting, as they reviewed the final custody agreement together. "Not every client handles this process with the grace and clarity you've shown throughout." Claire appreciated the words, though some days they felt harder to believe than others, especially watching Ellie struggle silently with the changes happening around her. Her daughter had grown quieter since Daniel's departure, more guarded, less willing to share her feelings openly the way she once had. Claire made a point of creating consistent, gentle spaces for Ellie to process her emotions, scheduling regular sessions with a child therapist who specialized in helping children navigate family transitions. "She's carrying more than she's showing you," the therapist explained during one of their meetings. "But she's also incredibly resilient. Kids often surprise us with how well they adapt, especially when they have a stable, loving parent providing consistency." Claire took those words to heart, dedicating herself fully to providing exactly that consistency for both her children, even during moments when her own emotional reserves felt dangerously low. She established new routines: family dinners every evening regardless of how tired she felt, weekend outings to parks and museums, bedtime stories that stretched a few extra minutes longer than strictly necessary, small gestures that slowly rebuilt a sense of safety and normalcy within their reshaped family. Months passed, and Claire found herself gradually settling into an unexpected rhythm of independence that felt surprisingly fulfilling. She took on additional responsibilities at work, eventually being promoted to lead counselor at her school, a position that came with increased respect among her colleagues and a genuine sense of professional accomplishment she hadn't fully appreciated during her years focused primarily on family life. During this period, she also began cautiously reconnecting with parts of her identity that extended beyond her role as wife and mother. She started running in the mornings before the children woke up, finding unexpected clarity in the quiet solitude of early sunrise jogs through her neighborhood. She read voraciously, rediscovering a passion for literature that had quietly disappeared over the years of managing household responsibilities and family obligations. One evening, several months after the separation, Grace invited Claire to a small gathering hosted by a mutual friend, insisting gently that it was time for Claire to start re-engaging socially beyond her usual small circle. Claire hesitated at first, uncertain whether she was ready for anything resembling a social event, but eventually agreed, recognizing the truth in Grace's persistent encouragement. At the gathering, Claire found herself talking with Henry Whitfield, a soft-spoken architect who worked at a different firm than Daniel's, someone Grace had mentioned briefly but never with any particular emphasis. Their conversation began simply enough, discussing shared interests in architecture and design, but gradually deepened into something more genuine, more comfortable than Claire had expected from a casual social interaction. "You seem like someone who's been through something significant recently," Henry observed at one point during their conversation, his tone gentle rather than presumptuous. Claire smiled faintly, appreciating his perceptiveness without feeling pressured to explain further. "Is it that obvious?" "Not obvious," Henry said, "just thoughtful, I suppose. Like someone who's learned to value things differently than before." The observation struck Claire as unexpectedly accurate, capturing something about her personal growth that she hadn't fully articulated even to herself yet. They exchanged contact information before the evening ended, though Claire made no immediate commitments about pursuing anything further. She wasn't ready for romance, not yet, still deeply focused on healing and stability for herself and her children. But the interaction left her with a small, encouraging reminder that her capacity for genuine connection hadn't been permanently damaged by Daniel's betrayal. As the holiday season approached, nearly a year after Daniel's departure, Claire found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had transformed during those difficult months. The woman who once quietly ignored her own doubts, who prioritized peace over honesty, who had folded away significant parts of her own identity to accommodate a marriage that ultimately proved unworthy of that sacrifice, had gradually transformed into someone far more confident, far more clear about her own worth and boundaries. She still allowed Daniel regular visits with the children, maintaining a carefully professional co-parenting relationship despite the deep personal wounds that remained between them. Their interactions during these visits had grown steadily more civil over time, though Claire remained firmly guarded regarding any possibility of romantic reconciliation, unconvinced that genuine trust could ever be fully rebuilt after such a profound betrayal. During one visit, as Daniel dropped off the children after a weekend outing, he lingered slightly at the door, his expression carrying a familiar hesitance that Claire had come to recognize over the past several months. "You seem happy," he observed quietly. "Genuinely happy, I mean, not just pretending for the kids' sake." Claire considered his words carefully before responding. "I am happy," she said simply. "It took a lot of work to get here, but yes, I think I finally am." Daniel nodded slowly, something like quiet acceptance settling over his expression. "I'm glad," he said, and for the first time since their separation, Claire believed the sincerity behind his words completely. As she closed the door behind him and returned to her children, now laughing together in the living room, Claire allowed herself a small, private moment of gratitude, not for the pain Daniel had caused, but for the unexpected strength and clarity that pain had ultimately revealed within her. She had entered this difficult chapter of her life feeling broken, betrayed, and uncertain about the future. She emerged from it, months later, as someone entirely rebuilt, someone who understood her own worth far more deeply than she ever had during the comfortable complacency of her previous marriage. The house that once felt haunted by absence and betrayal had slowly transformed into something entirely different. A home built on her own terms, filled with laughter that belonged genuinely to her and her children, unburdened by the quiet compromises and silent sacrifices that had once defined her daily life. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, Claire faced them now not as a woman waiting anxiously for someone else to determine her happiness, but as someone who had discovered, through devastating circumstances, exactly how capable she truly was of building a meaningful, fulfilling life entirely on her own. Nearly 2 years had passed since the night Daniel walked out of his family's home, and the changes within him had grown slowly, quietly, through countless difficult sessions with his therapist, through the humbling experience of rebuilding his life from a hollow starting point, through the daily discipline of showing up consistently for his children despite no longer living under the same roof. He had transferred permanently to the new branch of his firm, distancing himself entirely from Vanessa, who had eventually left the company altogether following an uncomfortable falling out with Nathan that became office gossip for several uncomfortable weeks before fading into irrelevance. Daniel had rebuilt a modest apartment life for himself, simple and unremarkable compared to the home he once shared with Claire, but stable in a way that reflected genuine effort rather than empty promises. His visits with Ellie and Noah had become a cherished, consistent part of his week, and slowly, gradually, Ellie's earlier guardedness had softened into something resembling the warm relationship they once shared before everything fell apart. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel arrived at Claire's house to pick up the children for their scheduled weekend visit, the familiar routine now comfortable rather than tense. Claire answered the door, her expression relaxed in a way that reflected the genuine stability she had built for herself over the past 2 years. "They're just finishing up a snack," Claire said, stepping aside to let him wait in the entryway. "Should be ready in a few minutes." Daniel nodded, glancing around the familiar entryway, noting small changes throughout the house, new paint colors, rearranged furniture, subtle signs of a life that had continued evolving entirely independent of him. "The house looks great," he said sincerely. "Thank you," Claire replied simply, without elaboration, though there was no coldness in her tone, only the comfortable neutrality that had developed between them over many months of careful, respectful co-parenting. As they waited, Daniel found himself, not for the first time, considering whether he should finally ask the question that had been quietly building within him for several months now. He had spent considerable time in therapy exploring his own growth, his own understanding of the mistakes that had led to their separation, and increasingly, he found himself wondering whether any possibility remained for eventual reconciliation, however distant or uncertain that possibility might be. "Claire," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" Claire glanced at him, her expression curious but guarded. "Of course." "Do you think there's any chance," Daniel began, choosing his words with deliberate care, "that someday we could try again? I know I don't deserve that chance. I know the trust I broke might never fully be rebuilt. But I've changed, Claire. Not because things fell apart with Vanessa, but because I've genuinely done the work to understand why I made the choices I made, and who I want to be instead." Claire listened quietly, her expression thoughtful rather than immediately dismissive, though Daniel could sense the careful consideration behind her silence. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the calm clarity that had become so characteristic of her over the past 2 years. "I appreciate you asking that honestly," she said. "And I do believe you've changed, Daniel. I've seen it in how consistent you've been with the kids, in how you've handled yourself during this entire process. That growth matters, and I'm genuinely glad you found it." Daniel felt a small flicker of hope building within his chest, though something in Claire's tone suggested the conversation was not moving toward the answer he had hoped for. "But," Claire continued gently, "I don't think reconciliation is the right path for us, not anymore. I spent a long time rebuilding myself after everything that happened, finding out exactly who I am outside of our marriage, outside of the role I had settled into over so many years. And honestly, Daniel, I like who I've become. I'm not willing to risk losing that clarity by returning to something that, however much you've changed, still carries so much painful history between us." Daniel absorbed her words slowly, feeling a complicated mixture of disappointment and, surprisingly, genuine respect for the honesty and self-assurance behind her decision. This was not the same woman who had once quietly suppressed her doubts for the sake of maintaining peace within their marriage. This was someone who had learned, through devastating circumstances, exactly what she needed and deserved, and who was no longer willing to compromise that understanding for anyone, including him. "I understand," Daniel said quietly, and for the first time he genuinely meant it without the desperate hope for a different answer lingering beneath his words. "I'm glad you're happy, Claire, truly, even if that happiness doesn't include me in the way I once hoped it might." Claire offered him a small, genuine smile. "We're good co-parents," she said. "That matters more than anything else right now. The kids see us getting along, respecting each other, and that stability is worth far more than trying to force something back together that's already found its own peaceful resolution, even if it looks different than either of us originally expected." Their conversation was interrupted moments later by Ellie and Noah bounding down the stairs, backpacks ready for their weekend with their father. The tension of the previous moment dissolved naturally into the familiar warmth of family routine, Daniel kneeling down to help Noah with his shoes while Ellie chattered excitedly about her week at school. As Daniel finally left with the children, Claire stood in the doorway watching them walk toward his car, a complicated mixture of emotions settling over her. There was no bitterness in her decision, no lingering anger driving her choice to remain separate from Daniel despite his genuine growth. There was simply clarity, hard-won and deeply valued, about the kind of life she wanted to continue building for herself and her children moving forward. Later that evening, alone in the quiet house, Claire sat on her porch with a cup of tea, reflecting on the long, difficult journey that had brought her to this particular moment of peace. She thought about the woman she had been 2 years earlier, sitting frozen in her hallway, staring at a message that shattered her entire understanding of her marriage. She thought about the tears, the humiliation, the devastating months of rebuilding that had followed. And she thought about who she had become since then, stronger, more self-assured, deeply connected to her own sense of worth in a way she hadn't fully possessed before everything fell apart. The betrayal that once felt like the ending of everything meaningful in her life had, unexpectedly, become the beginning of a far more authentic, fulfilling chapter. one built entirely on her own terms rather than shaped around someone else's choices and comfort. Her phone buzzed gently beside her. A message from Henry, the architect she had met at Grace's gathering nearly 2 years earlier, someone who had slowly, patiently become an important part of her life over recent months, never rushing her healing process, always respecting the careful pace she needed to feel genuinely ready for something new. Dinner Friday. I found that little Italian place you mentioned last week. Claire smiled, typing back a simple confirmation, appreciating the easy, uncomplicated warmth of a relationship built on honesty and mutual respect from the very beginning, entirely different from the quiet compromises and hidden struggles that had once defined her first marriage. As the evening settled peacefully around her, Claire allowed herself a final, reflective moment of gratitude, not for the pain Daniel had once caused, but for everything that pain had ultimately taught her about her own resilience, her own worth, and her own capacity to rebuild something genuinely beautiful from the wreckage of devastating betrayal. Daniel had once mocked her tears, believing he was walking toward something better while leaving her broken behind him. Instead, it was Claire who had risen from that devastating night, transformed into someone stronger, wiser, and genuinely at peace with the life she had built entirely on her own terms. And somewhere across the city, Daniel, too, had finally learned the true cost of the choices he once made so carelessly, understanding now, far too late for reconciliation, but perhaps just in time for genuine personal growth, exactly what he had so foolishly thrown away, and exactly what real love and commitment actually required all along. 5 years later, Claire stood in the backyard of her new home, watching Ellie, now a confident teenager, laugh with friends around a small bonfire, while Noah, taller and more independent with each passing year, tossed a football with Henry, who had become a steady, loving presence in their lives long before he and Claire had finally married the previous spring. The blended family they had carefully built together felt nothing like the fragile, uncertain beginning Claire once feared during those painful early months following her divorce. Henry had never tried to replace Daniel in the children's lives, understanding instinctively that genuine trust required patience rather than force. Instead, he had simply shown up, consistently and reliably, year after year, earning Ellie and Noah's affection naturally through countless small moments of kindness and steady presence. Claire often marveled at how effortlessly their new family had formed around mutual respect and honesty, qualities she now understood were essential foundations she had once overlooked during her first marriage. Daniel, too, had continued his own quiet evolution over the years. He had remained an active, dedicated father, never missing a scheduled visit, showing up consistently for school events, sports games, and important milestones in his children's lives. He eventually began dating again, cautiously and thoughtfully, eventually building a stable relationship with a woman named Sophie Hartley, a kind-hearted teacher who valued honesty and consistency just as deeply as Claire once had. Occasionally, at family gatherings surrounding the children's milestones, Daniel and Claire would find themselves standing together, watching their children grow into confident, secure young adults despite the difficult chapter their family had once endured. Their relationship, while never again romantic, had settled comfortably into genuine friendship, built upon mutual respect and shared dedication toward their children's happiness. During one such gathering, celebrating Ellie's high school graduation, Daniel found himself standing beside Claire near the refreshment table, watching their daughter accept warm congratulations from friends and family members scattered across the celebration. "We did that," Daniel said quietly, nodding toward Ellie's confident, radiant smile. "Despite everything, we actually did that together." Claire smiled, genuine warmth reflected in her expression. "We did," she agreed. "It took a lot of work to get here from both of us, but yes, we did." Daniel glanced at her, his expression carrying genuine gratitude rather than lingering regret. "Thank you," he said, "for never letting our mistakes define who our kids became, for giving them stability even when everything else felt uncertain." "We both did that," Claire corrected gently. You showed up too, Daniel, every single time for years now. That matters more than you probably realize. Their conversation was interrupted by Noah calling them over for a family photograph, and they walked together toward their children, standing side by side without any trace of the painful tension that had once defined their interactions. The photograph captured a moment neither of them could have imagined during those devastating early days following their separation. A family reshaped by hardship, yet ultimately strengthened by the honest, difficult work both parents had invested into rebuilding trust, respect, and genuine cooperation for the sake of their children's happiness. As the celebration continued into the evening, Claire found herself reflecting on the long, winding journey that had brought her to this particular moment of peace and fulfillment. She thought about the frightened, heartbroken woman she had once been, sitting alone in a dark kitchen, staring at a phone screen that shattered her entire understanding of her marriage. She thought about the painful months that followed, the humiliation, the uncertainty, the exhausting work of rebuilding her identity from the ground up. And she thought about everything that painful chapter had ultimately taught her, that genuine strength often emerges most powerfully from devastating circumstances, that self-respect matters more than the comfortable illusion of a relationship built on hidden betrayal, and that healing, while never linear or easy, remains entirely possible when approached with patience, honesty, and genuine determination. Daniel, standing nearby with Sophie Hartley's hand gently clasped in his own, watched his children celebrating this important milestone with genuine pride and gratitude, understanding now, more deeply than ever before, the true value of the family he had once carelessly risked losing entirely. The painful lessons from those difficult years had reshaped him into someone far more thoughtful, more honest, and more genuinely present than the man who had once mocked his wife's tears and walked away so carelessly toward a fantasy that ultimately proved worthless. Both Claire and Daniel had, in their own separate ways, transformed devastating betrayal into meaningful personal growth, rebuilding lives and relationships far more genuine and fulfilling than the fragile illusions that had once defined their earlier years together. Their children, watching this transformation unfold gradually over the years, absorbed invaluable lessons about resilience, honesty, and the genuine possibility of healing even after profound heartbreak. As the evening celebration finally wound down, Claire stood beside Henry, watching Ellie and Noah say goodbye to their friends, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the unexpected, difficult path that had ultimately led her toward genuine happiness and fulfillment. The devastating betrayal she once endured no longer defined her identity or her family's story. Instead, it had become simply one difficult chapter within a much larger, ultimately triumphant journey toward authentic strength, self-respect, and lasting happiness built entirely on her own terms. The welcome Daniel once expected on that devastating night years earlier had never arrived, leaving him instead with painful isolation and difficult self-reflection. But the genuine growth that eventually emerged from that humbling experience had ultimately given him something far more valuable than the fleeting excitement he once foolishly chased. A renewed understanding of authentic love, consistent responsibility, and the profound importance of honoring the commitments and relationships that truly mattered most in life. And Claire, who had once wept quietly in a dark, empty kitchen, mourning the collapse of the life she had carefully built, had emerged from that devastating heartbreak, transformed into someone stronger, wiser, and more genuinely at peace than she had ever imagined possible during those darkest early days. Her story ultimately became not one defined by betrayal and loss, but by resilience, growth, and the powerful, unwavering strength that could emerge from even the most painful chapters of a person's life.